The Hizmet movement then has tried to articulate and be a spokesvoice for a more moderate vision of what it is that Islamic sensitivities are. The movement then has tried to articulate and be Yes, I'm Dr. Earle Waugh. I am the director of the Center for Health and Culture in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta. I am a Professor Emeritus of Islamic Studies at the university, and I moved to medicine after I finished my career in arts. So I spent most of my life in the Faculty of Arts, and I have been in medicine now around 8 or 9 years. Actually, I came in contact with some aspects of Hizmet and some of their ideas quite some time ago, because of course, they've been influenced by Sufism. And so one of the areas of my specialization was Sufi tradition. So the Hizmet tradition blends in with the Sufi ideas. So Hizmet as a distinctive movement only came to my attention in about the last 5 to 6 years. I think since you've been in town, and since I've come in contact with a more active group of people who are interested in Fethullah Gulen. So yeah, I would say this group of people introduced me to the ideas of this particular movement. The Hizmet movement has a number of different goals, but from my perspective, what is really significant about it is that it tries to address a lacuna in what I would call the Islamic body politic. As we know, in Islam, at least in Sunni Islam, there is no absolute spokesperson. There is no pope, or there's no caliph. So one of the problems that Islam has had in the West, and specifically in North America, is that there is no real Islamic body that can speak with authority about the views that Sunnis have. The Hizmet movement at least has been an articulate voice of a Sunni sort that speaks out of spiritual vision and tries to articulate for the population at large a stance of what we would call a spiritual perspective on all of these things that have been happening. So the Hizmet movement then has tried to articulate and be a spokesvoice for a more moderate vision of what it is that Islamic sensitivities are. So I think that's probably the best way of putting it. First of all, my knowledge of Fethullah Gulen goes back to my exploration of what I would call Islam in Turkish environments, and then the development of post-Kemalist Turkey, and then some of the developments of the Islamist tradition that has had an impact in Turkey. So I'll try to keep my thoughts on that fairly light and simple if I can. And I would say that Mr. Fethullah Gulen expresses a moderate view of Islam, one that still has political content, but that does not see the state as an Islamic entity. So that for him, what we're really talking about is a spiritual empire, not a physical or a political or a state empire. And I think one of the things that he finds most difficult to deal with is the fact that the impact of Islamism and conservative Islam that comes out of the Salafi tradition and comes out of the Wahhabi tradition, I think that's not in tune with either the tenor or the way in which Turkish people see their religious tradition unfolding. I also think that you have to understand Turkish Islam as arising out of a reaction to the secularist philosophies of Kemalism. And that on the one hand, what we see in the Turkish political realm now is an attempt to back away from that kind of secularist monolithic idea that we have to secularize everything and we have to follow the West in everything and we have to do all of these things to modernize the tradition. That kind of idea is dead. And I think Mr. Gulen recognizes that what you have to do after a country has been infused with secularist ideology, you have to bring back a spiritual dimension. You have to bring back an Islam that understands the human need to embrace tradition sometimes. That it's good to affirm things like love and care and concern, and that these values have universal resonance. So that it's important then, from his perspective, that this side of Islam be articulated. There's a couple of things to be said about what I would call the educational thrust of this movement. And the first thing that strikes you about this is that they don't argue that any one particular ethnic or cultural attitude needs to dominate the school. That is, you don't have to all dress the same intellectually. That is, you might come with the same kind of school uniform on, but that doesn't mean that you all have to think the same way or you all have to believe the same thing. So that's one dimension of it. The other dimension of it is, of course, that education as it has developed in the West has argued that it has a kind of neutral dimension to it, right? That is, that you can learn science, you can learn math, you can learn things like English and psychology and physics and all of these things, that you can learn these without having to disturb what I would call a religious sensitivity. So that means then that education can develop a culture of understanding that takes one away from the sources of violence and the sources of disrespect. So in effect then, education is a possible way in which you can bring previous enemies together in a safe and free kind of cultural encounter without what's going on outside necessarily impacting on it. The things that are of most critical for many people are the these things that they have no control over. So disasters like earthquakes and like floods and things like that, these are things that people had never assumed were going to happen. And so the fact of the matter is that many of these things take place in an environment that doesn't have funding to assist them. Unlike the flooding in Calgary, for example, where you've got a rich government on the one hand sitting in Edmonton and another rich one sitting in Ottawa that can provide funding to help relieve these things. There are some countries in the world who don't have any kind of support at all. So what the Hizmet movement tries to do then is to tap into the concern that people have for these natural disasters and so for these kinds of terrible catastrophes, to try to help people cope with them. Most great organizations in the world that are dealing with aid are not interested in whether these are Christians or Muslims or Jews or whatever they are. Most aid organizations are what we would call colorblind. They should be colorblind. And most people who give their money to those kinds of organizations really insist that they be colorblind and that they be religious blind too, because in fact, we're trying to deal with the human element here. And so this goes back to a basic principle, I think, of Fethullah Gulen, and that is that the human dimension is the most important dimension in any of these things. And so the aid programs that they have put in place have been directed towards those kinds of catastrophes that need an assistance of a way beyond what the local government can do. And you'd have to admire the fact that they have done that. I don't know if they've been any more successful in, let's say, World Vision in handling children, or whether they've been any more successful than, let's say, the United Nations in providing health care. They are limited in the amount that they can do because of personnel. After all, it's based mainly, I think, on contributions from ordinary folks who are working every day. So the volunteer dimension of Hizmet can only be expanded to take in so much in the way of aid. So they are limited in the sense that they can only do what the personnel that they have available can do. But what is important, I think, is that they have decided that they will make it a world movement. In other words, they won't just stick into Turkey, right? And they just won't look into things in, let's say, in the Balkans. They will do things all over the world. And I think that's quite admirable.
So Hizmet movement is tremendously valuable, especially in North America and perhaps throughout Europe and all the world, as representing Islam as a religion with a strong spiritual commitment, but not one which condemns people whose spiritual connections or non-spiritual connections are otherwise.
The Hizmet movement is a necessary corrective to the view of Islam that unfortunately has been painted by Puritanism, extremism, and violence.